Hi, I'm Ann Redelf. I'm a retired medical doctor and psychiatrist. And today I'm going to be delivering a presentation. One moment, I'll get it started. Whoops. Entitled Breaking the Stigma of Mental Illness by Recognizing the Traumatized Soul. I often hear people say, "What's wrong with that kid?" Or "What's wrong with that person?" Our medical industry seeks to answer those questions with many different diagnoses, which I myself participated in many years ago. My decades of life experience, however, have taught me to ask a different question, which is, what life experience would cause a normal person to act in that manner? This exploration has taken me away from labeling people with diagnoses. In fact, it has led me to an understanding of the impact of trauma on children and how this impact, untreated, continues into adulthood. I speak to you today not as a retired medical doctor and psychiatrist, but as a human being who has had many human and inhuman experiences. Through this wealth of experience, I've come to understand how the human becomes the inhuman. The information I'm sharing is what I've learned from a lifetime experience with trauma and the traumatized. Some of this knowledge you won't find in other sources, but it's been instrumental in my life, both personally and professionally. I hope it will be helpful to you too. And I also hope you will share what you learned today so that more people will recognize unresolved trauma in their loved ones and help them to get the treatment that they need to recover. The future of our nation and world depends on it. Theme 1, we live in a traumatic world. Imagine that a child in your family doesn't want to go to school. He seems fearful and becomes tearful at times. He has been a bright and well-behaved child, but yet he's struggling with his schoolwork and getting increasingly agitated and oppositional. Then one day after school, he comes home with his face red and puffy. Horrified, you ask what happened. And with much encouragement from you, he finally tells you that a big bully beat him with her fist and had been beating him for quite some time. Who, you demand? Which child did this to you? And trembling in fear, he says, it was my teacher. You suddenly realize this boy's soul has been crying out for help for months, but only now do you understand the message. How would you react? I had struck up a conversation with a fellow shopper in a store, and I told her my expertise was in the area of human psychological development and the trauma that often interferes. She responded with the experience I just shared with you, adding, this trauma has taken quite a toll on my young son's soul. So how does a once normal, healthy child grow into a seeming adult who victimizes vulnerable and needy children, taking a toll on their souls? This is what we'll be talking about today, the gradual toll that trauma takes on children. You'll learn to recognize the traumatized child in bodies small and large. And one of the many reasons it's essential that we recognize traumatized children is because when we don't, these kids grow into physical adults who are stuck psychologically as young children. And the psychologically young always act out their unresolved traumas with others. And then they avoid what they've just done. Automatic recreation and avoidance of trauma is how I categorize the symptoms of post-traumatic stress, which I'll be talking about today as well. But first, let's start at the beginning. We all know the image of a normal, healthy child, don't we? Grinning from ear to ear, seemingly boundless energy, full of fun. What are some more qualities that come to mind when you think of a traumatized or a normal child, a healthy child? Well, when I think of a healthy child, the words that come to mind are active, playful, expressive, creative, silly, curious. Healthy kids are eager to discover new things and learn, and they can absorb information like a sponge. But what about this child? Well, this may be a healthy child who has suffered some stress or even a trauma. I define trauma as an extreme or overwhelming stress, one that is beyond a person's ability to cope. This little girl, for example, might have seen her dog run over by a car, and then her beloved grandpa dropped dead in front of her of a heart attack. What about this angry child? Maybe his mom promised to take him out to dinner and a movie if he got good grades. So he worked really hard and got straight A's. Well, 1B. But when he came home to celebrate, he found his mom had celebrated without him. She had spent the money on an expensive bottle of wine, and she was now drunk on the couch. Ouch. And what do you see in this isolating child? This child may have a domestic violence situation going on at home, and she's learning to hide herself away to keep from being hurt. Depending on what's going on, normal, healthy children show a full range of emotions and behaviors, from happy and exuberant to engaged and focused, to sad and crying, angry and irritable, fearful and isolating, and so on. So just as a child who's splashing and swimming is in a body of water, children who are reacting are often making clear statements about their environments, whether in the past or the present. Healthy children react to the stresses and traumas in their lives. They have a small reaction for a small stress and a large reaction for trauma. This is a biologically built-in mechanism because young children are dependent on adults to care for them. And their reactions let these caregivers know that there is a problem. When we don't know about the stresses and trauma that healthy children are reacting to, we might assume these kids are reacting in an unhealthy manner, or maybe they're even mentally ill. This happens a lot. Theme 3, when trauma is ongoing, kids' reactions can become stuck. When we don't know the traumas children are reacting to, the problems often continue. Ongoing trauma means these kids' healthy reactions will become ongoing too. And 3 things can happen to these once healthy reactions. First of all, kids can become stuck in their normal reactions. So let's go back to that sad little girl that I talked about, whose pet died and then her grandpa died. Well, they were the ones that kept her parents' stress to a minimum. And with them gone, their calming presence gone, mom and dad start arguing and then fighting. And then dad ends up leaving. And not long after that, mom comes down with cancer. Oh, that's some serious trauma. In reaction, the girl stops smiling and becomes very serious. So any loss may cause temporary sadness and a bout of crying, but chronic severe loss left untreated can lead to an immobile depression. Yes, a traumatized person is thus labeled as mentally ill. And this brings me to point number 2. When children experience trauma after trauma, their reactions can become extreme. Again, a biologically built-in mechanism to get urgent attention and help. So let's say that angry boy I told you about suffers one injustice after another at the hands of his alcoholic mom. Well, he may become destructively rageful, and he may act out his rage, as in hurting property or people. And he might also act in his rage, as in getting sick or becoming an alcoholic himself. So he's likely to, again, get diagnoses of physical or mental illness. And this extreme reacting makes sense, right? A human voice that's not heard gets louder and louder in an attempt to be heard. But over time, when children's reactions are not adequately addressed, not treated with love and care, and the ongoing traumas are not stopped, the opposite happens. This human voice gets softer and softer. And as the traumas continue over time, children's reactions may stop. So just as the girl who has a domestic violence situation at home is learning to hide herself away to keep from being harmed, kids grow to hide away the parts of themselves that experience and express their hurts. Protecting what is tender is natural, right? This is a way of minimizing pain.
So what can be done?
And when physical trauma is ongoing, kids can become physically or emotionally unfeeling to protect themselves. So a boy suffers a beating, but he no longer cries in pain. And over time, he may not even be aware of his sadness in himself or in anyone. And a girl endures an injustice, and she has no anger. And over time, she may no longer even notice injustice. So kids numb their minds too. And this mental numbing can interfere with learning. Hello, learning disorders. So children hiding away aspects of their humanity is a serious problem because every aspect of a child has a vital function to fulfill. For example, our emotions are sensitive instruments that alert us to what's going on in our environments, such as sad or unjust circumstances. And when we don't have access to these emotions, we may not notice the traumatized people who lack the ability to consistently treat us well. And we're traumatized further. Also, emotions are a key area through which we relate to one another. Without them, relationships become strained and intimacy becomes impossible. So take a moment to imagine what your life would be like without your emotions. Now, consider what your life would be like if all people express the fullness of their feelings in constructive and creative ways. Theme 4, Traumatized children retreat into their imaginations. Traumatized kids do whatever they can to minimize their suffering. When the traumas continue, despite their best efforts to get help through their reactions, they may escape to their imaginations and hide in a new good guy character and a storyline that does meet their needs. A typical boy imagines himself a tough guy that no one messes with. And a typical girl might imagine herself to be an angel that everyone adores. And these kids imagine having a life where there is no trauma, or at least nothing serious. They play act the image of a normal child with a relatively normal life story. Or at least, well, if the trauma is undeniable, they may pretend, well, it didn't bother me. Or they may even make up a story that all this trauma was actually a good thing. They liked it and wanted it. And they may even become victimizers themselves. Of course, sometimes the creative minds of traumatized children escape their traumatic reality by creating another reality entirely, losing themselves in fantasy or psychosis. Whatever characters and stories children create, they attach to them, and they grow to care for and protect their characters and stories over human life.
This is depressing as well.
Meanwhile, kids hide their traumatic truths, or they may even forget about them. The term for this is dissociation. Their minds disassociate from the part or parts of themselves that have endured the trauma. That bad guy that was hurt, that's not me. I'm a good guy. So each child now has two or more lives. And if the trauma is extreme and unrelenting, this separation process can go on many times. And the problem with this survival technique is that these traumatized parts that kids have dissociated off live a life apart from their conscious awareness. The new good guy characters don't know what these bad guy castaway parts say or do. And people may tell them, and they say, I didn't say that, or I would never do that, when their good guy character wouldn't, but the traumatized part of them would, and has done many times possibly. I find that when kids start becoming aware of these bad guy characters within them, and they are touched upon, their experiences or what they themselves have perpetrated, symptoms of anxiety or even panic are common. Since trauma is what these traumatized bad guy parts have known, this is what they imitate. They recreate their traumas and their relationships with others. Meanwhile, the relatively normal character the child now claims for his identity, since it was created to escape the trauma, continues to avoid anything or anyone that reminds him or her of these hidden away traumatic experiences. Again, these two stances of automatic recreating and avoiding trauma are how I delineate the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Without treatment, these traumatized kids grow into traumatized adults who live life as a limited character with fixed, predictable reactions. And I put quotes around this term adults because they are only physically mature, but emotionally and mentally immature. These adults are numb to essential parts of their human nature, and they are similarly insensitive to these qualities in others, or they attack them. And the brutal teacher I told you about who beat her pupil is an extreme example of this. These traumatized adults then work with children or have children of their own, and they are incapable of responding appropriately to their unique moment by moment needs. So let's return to that little girl who experienced so many losses in adulthood and was stuck in her sadness. She grows up to have a major depression untreated. She has a family, and nothing her kids do can make her happy. There may be no obvious incentive for these kids to make improvements or achieve any goals because mom gives them no positive response. And let's say that rageful boy later in life has a family, and he responds to his kids' slightest misbehaviors with extreme violent reactions. One child may grow to misbehave in an extreme way, imitating his father. At least then the punishments would fit the crimes. Another child, in contrast, may tiptoe through life, afraid to upset anyone, like her dad. And guess which child gets a label of mental illness? How about the girl who was hiding herself away because of the domestic violence situation at home? She may be so distant in her manner of relating that she's oblivious to her children's pain. And with such detachment, she doesn't notice all the stresses that her kids are exposed to, that they need her help to negotiate. I find that most people are stuck in a particular character with some form of traumatic reaction. They may be depressed, angry, or fearfully detached. They may show these stuck reactions overtly or covertly. For example, overt depression may manifest as a woman who's been obviously sad for many years and poorly functioning because of this sadness. Whereas covert depression would be her husband's condition if he treats her badly, contributing to her sadness. Spouses like this typically have an unhappy inner child who is acting out his grief. How about the example of someone who's very engaging in the public eye, but he ignores his family's emotional needs when he's at home? Many people have hidden away the most traumatized parts of themselves in the unconscious mind and forgotten about them, as well as their most serious traumas. Yet our whole souls know about every part of us and seek to meet the needs of every part, which includes our need to return to wholeness. To receive and act on this wise counsel, we have to begin listening to our souls. And the more we heal our own trauma, the more we recognize how traumatized most people are, at least in part. Theme 5, post-traumatic stress is a global pandemic. To assess and help so many traumatized children and bodies, small and large, we have to thoroughly understand this condition of post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress is the normal response of every healthy human being to overwhelming stress left untreated. Unfortunately, most traumatized people don't recognize that they have post-traumatic stress because they've learned to associate it with obviously life-threatening trauma, such as growing up in inner city housing projects where violence is overt and commonplace. But there are many traumas in everyone's life that threatens our human lives, particularly when we're children. And these can cause post-traumatic stress. Take the scenario of a boy walking into the office of his work-at-home mom, and he says, "Mom, I'm hungry." Mom looks at her busy schedule and says, "Sweetheart, lunch is at noon." "But I'm hungry now," he says. Mom counters with, "Oh, it won't kill you to wait until noon, will it?" "No," he responds factually. "Okay, then run along." And mom goes back to work. Now, this situation might not seem like a big deal, but if it happens routinely, the mom is teaching her child that an inanimate schedule is more important than her child's human needs. And mom is encouraging him to numb his physical feelings to adapt to a schedule, rather than mom adapting her schedule to meet her child's needs, or at least responding to his feelings and need by telling him where he might get a snack. So this scenario is vital to understand because it's commonplace in our culture. When we ignore children's legitimate experience, reaction, and needs, it's a problem. And as a result of this routine discounting, their humanity is gradually worn down. In American culture, schedules, protocols, procedures, mandates, and payment plans are increasingly valued more than human need, which contributes to the increasing number of people succumbing to post-traumatic stress. And notice that I leave off the word disorder from this otherwise common term. Post-traumatic stress is not a disorder. It's an injury. For example, our physical bodies respond to physical trauma in similar ways. We bruise when we're hit, and we bleed when we're cut. And psychological bodies too react to psychological trauma in similar ways, particularly when we're young. Post-traumatic stress is the name for the symptoms that develop over time when these traumatic reactions are left untreated. Now, I've invited an extreme trauma survivor to meet with you today and tell you her story. Give me a moment to find her. Oh, there she is. I found her inside myself. Yes, we all have trauma survivors inside ourselves. It's just a matter of how many, what degree they've been traumatized, and a few other things. But it's important not to be fooled by adult bodies, titles or positions, or appearances of health or wealth. Traumatized people can be found just about everywhere we go. For example, my financially successful father was that boy who endured one injustice after another. For my father, he was brutalized by his 3 unmarried uncles and others. And my dad took on the character of a tough guy. He made up a story that all the brutality didn't bother him. He liked it and even wanted it. At least that was his storyline. I say all the brutality my father endured did indeed bother him, because he became a physical adult that was full of destructive rage. And he took this out on his family. After many years of reacting and becoming stuck in those reactions, I grew to realize he was a devastated individual that had been overwhelmed by trauma, which he compulsively recreated. For example, he was a control freak. He would regularly instruct me in exactly what he wanted me to say and do, as was done to him. And as a small child, I would forget what he told me, as small children do, and he would punish me to the extreme. To this day, my body still at times shows the results of these violent memories, and that my voice can become shaky or my hands tremble when I'm doing something dad would not approve of, like talking to people about recognizing trauma in children. Even though my dad died a few years ago, my body's still afraid that it'll be harmed yet again. When traumas are routine occurrences over many, many years, the injuries to body, heart, and mind can take a long time to completely recover.
What's the good news?
My father's character, in his mind, was a good guy, a family man who valiantly led the way for his children from one sunny day to the next. His storyline was that we were a happy family, so he insisted I look happy. For example, if anyone ever asked me, "How are you?" I was to say, "I'm fine, thank you. How are you?" Just as my father had taught me. So trauma can show itself not only in stuck negative emotions, such as grief, anger, or fear, but also stuck positive emotions, such as unwavering happiness. To escape from my miserable existence, I withdrew into my schoolwork and took on the character of an exceptional student. Guess whose idea that was? Yep, my dad's. So traumatized kids don't always show up with behavior problems. They can also reveal themselves with extremes of achievement, performance, or even angelic personality traits. Because of the diversity of expression of traumatized kids, spotting them may not be easy, particularly when they're cloaked in adult bodies. The key is the rigidity of each traumatized trait. There's a frozen quality. Traumatized children can't alter their seemingly bad or good behavior when asked. Any rigid trait is evidence of unresolved trauma. My father's unresolved trauma manifested mostly through the first category of post-traumatic stress. He consistently and compulsively recreated his abusive and neglectful childhood with his own family. My post-traumatic stress was more of the avoidant variety. I avoided the devastation of my father robbing me of my voice, my will, my basic human rights by hiding myself away in my room or the library, studying. In my experience, these dynamics of recreation and avoidance of trauma are behind most people's relationship problems and mental illnesses. When looking for evidence of trauma in adults or children, please notice both those who look particularly bad, recreating their traumas, or look particularly good, avoiding whatever reminds them of their traumas, which includes the most traumatized parts of themselves. High achieving trauma survivors are rarely investigated to what's going on at home. A tragedy. Were it not for my recurring urinary tract infections, digestive problems, and migraine headaches throughout childhood, few would have guessed that anything was wrong. And this brings me to my final point about traumatic reaction that I would like to bring up with you today. I've mentioned that when children's natural reactions are not heard as honest expressions of their human developmental needs being neglected or abused, the neglect and abuse typically continues. Their human voices, expressed in feelings, behaviors, and words, may then turn inward and speak through physical symptoms, such as through illness. For example, during my pediatrics rotation, one of the most common concerns expressed by parents who brought their sick young children to the emergency room was the possibility of an ear infection, since the febrile children were yanking on their ears. An otoscopic exam would often reveal a red inflamed eardrum and or ear canal. If we were trained in assessing emotional bodies as we were physical bodies, we might note that inflammation also means anger. In my experience, children with ear infections are often angry about what they're hearing. When pain is involved, they're saying, "What I'm hearing hurts." For example, they might be hearing cold, uncaring words. They might be hearing harsh, angry outbursts toward them or their loved ones. Or they might be hearing words that assert a fictional character and storyline. Their caregivers are pretending rather than sharing their honest feelings and thoughts. Through ear infections, these children are physically expressing their emotional upset about what they're hearing. Physical illness, like mental illness, can be a way for humans of all ages to get much needed attention and help. For more information about traumatic reactions being expressed through bodily symptoms, please read my book, Illness Can Be the Cure. In conclusion, normal, healthy children react to the many stresses in our traumatic world. They react a little to a small stress, and they react a lot to a major trauma. And over time, with ongoing trauma, 3 things can happen. 1, kids can get stuck in their normal traumatic reactions. 2, kids can overreact, become extreme as the voice of their reactions desperately tries to get attention and help. And finally, 3, kids can underreact. Their reactions become minimal, or they can stop reacting entirely when that help they so desperately need is not forthcoming. And when kids' trauma is not adequately addressed and treated in childhood, these kids only mature physically. And while they may act out an adult character and storyline, parts of them stay stuck psychologically in early childhood. Remember, these are our shadow characters, are the bad guys within us who hide in our unconscious minds. These psychologically young parts emerge from time to time and recreate their childhood trauma with those who remind them of who they once were. The seemingly untraumatized character within these people, their good guy identities, will then avoid whatever reminds them of these traumatized parts and what they've done. This automatic recreation and avoidance of trauma are the 2 categories of post-traumatic stress. Remember, too, that when people's outward expressions of distress are not adequately remedied, they may then stuff their distress in their physical bodies, where it eventually turns into illness. Please understand that when physical symptoms are a reaction to chronic trauma, they too can become stuck over time, as with chronic health conditions. When the cries for help within these symptoms are unheard, these health conditions may then become extreme, as in grossly disabling or even life-threatening. Finally, people suffering from chronic trauma may even show little to no physical reaction to serious illness or injury until the prognosis is grave. I hope you will use this information I've shared with you today to recognize the many ways that kids and adults express their trauma. By emphasizing this information, I don't mean to say that trauma is the only cause for the many physical and psychological illnesses that our population is increasingly succumbing to, but that it is a significant and often overlooked component. And once the traumatic cause within each illness is recognized and treated, in my experience, the other components are more responsive to their particular treatments. Also, the more our unresolved traumas are treated, the more likely we are to choose gentle and effective means to remedy the other components of our illnesses. Theme 6. Once we understand the traumatic component of mental illness, and even many physical illnesses, we can more effectively help. And there's much we can do. Rather than assume that a depressed girl or woman has a biochemical defect or depressive disorder, let's find out which losses she may never have recovered from and is still reacting to. We can help her to grieve these losses and support her as she expresses all her thoughts and feelings about what happened and what she wished had happened instead. We can assist her in discovering how to meet her unmet needs. Rather than assume a raging boy or man has a conduct disorder or anger issues, let's consider which injustices he has endured and get professional help to assist him in working them through in a constructive manner. Rather than assume that a girl who hides herself away is shy and a woman who rarely leaves the house is a homebody or recluse. Think about who or what they might be avoiding. Again, most people hide their most serious trauma away in the unconscious mind. So you may need professional help to reach her. And please be alert to people's imaginary characters and storylines. Remember, these are young children's ways of getting their needs met, creating a fantasy of who they and their loved ones are and what their lives have been. If these traumatized children within bodies small and large are to psychologically mature, they need help to face reality. This means talking to them about their positive and negative traits and life experiences. And please don't assume that people who appear particularly impressive are only that. Be open to seeing any immature parts that their achievements may be an attempt to get away from or cover up. When someone is victimizing others, causing them to feel sad, angry, or fearful, look for these emotions within the victimizer. So often, an emotionally insensitive person compels others into the very feelings he has hidden away inside himself, which will need to be brought to consciousness if he is to return to health and wholeness. And finally, rather than assume that people with physical illness or disability are suffering from physical impairments, seek to find the psychological communication and whatever is going on. You may be amazed at what happens when traumatic reactions, whether overt or covert, are at last heard as a cry for help and responded to with love and care. I believe the best assumption we can make with people that are causing us stress is that they are recreating some unresolved trauma or avoiding it. And they may need our most mature humanity to stop these automatic recreation or avoidance patterns and start working through these traumas and their traumatic reactions. I also recommend competent professional help, since there are many dangers when dealing with the seriously traumatized. If you'd like more information about the widespread unresolved trauma expressing itself through so many of our societal problems, please read one of my books or watch one of my videos, all available on my website, redelfs.com. I also do private consultations where I help people to hear their own or their loved ones' souls and follow their wise counsel. If you're interested or you would just like to have a conversation, please contact me at gardenerofthesoul@icloud.com. And thank you for tuning in to this presentation. And thanks especially to Judy Giovangelo and Ben Speaks.